The cold German rain fell in steady sheets, a dreary curtain obscuring the airfield at Saint-Trond. Inside the heated operations shack, Major Johann Müller, a man whose face was a roadmap of the Eastern Front, sipped his ersatz coffee and allowed himself a rare, genuine smile. The report in his hand was pure gold, intercepted and decoded by the diligent boys at Bletchley Park, or so the abuer claimed. It detailed the planned American bomber raid for the next day, February 20, 1944. The target, the very ball-bearing factories his own Luftwaffe was tasked with defending. He tossed the flimsy paper onto the table, the gesture one of pure contempt. "Schwein," he muttered to his adjutant, Lieutenant Fischer, a young man whose cheeks still held the softness of youth. "They come again like clockwork, and we will be waiting." Fischer, eager to please, nodded vigorously. "The Jeschwader is at full strength, Herr Major. The new Focke-Wulfs have arrived. The Americans will have a very warm welcome." Müller walked to the large situation map pinned to the wall. Dozens of little black swastikas represented his fighter groups. A cluster of red pins far to the west showed the reported American formation. "They are brave, I give them that," Müller conceded, tracing the predicted flight path with a nicotine-stained finger. "But bravery is a poor substitute for range. They're little toy fighters, these P-47s and P-38s. They can only hold our hands for a short while. Once they turn back, our boys will fall upon the bombers like wolves on a wounded stag." He tapped the map over central Germany. "Here, this is where we will tear them apart. The slaughter will be magnificent." What Major Müller, a veteran of hundreds of aerial engagements, could not possibly comprehend was that the document he held was not a catastrophic intelligence failure by the Americans. It was a carefully laid piece of bait in a much larger, more audacious trap. While he studied his map with the confident eye of a predator, a revolution was already airborne, its wings slicing through the icy air high above the Atlantic, completely invisible to his radar, his spies, and his considerable experience. The Americans weren't just sending bombers. They were sending a statement, one wrapped in polished aluminum and powered by a single, revolutionary piece of machinery that was about to rewrite the rules of aerial warfare forever. The German High Command's confidence as 1944 dawned was not entirely without foundation. It was built upon a mountain of what they considered to be irrefutable evidence and deeply ingrained cultural and technical prejudices. For years, their intelligence assessments of American air power had been filtered through a lens of profound skepticism. The prevailing wisdom at the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, OKL, was succinctly summarized in a memo from Generalfeldmarschall Hugo Sperl in late 1943. "The American aircraft industry excels in quantity, not quality. Their pilots are inadequately trained. Their strategy is brutish and predictable. They lack the martial spirit." This assessment was rooted in several key and ultimately fatal misjudgments. The first was technological. The primary American escort fighter for most of 1943 had been the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It was a magnificent aircraft in a dive and could absorb staggering amounts of punishment, but it was a gas-guzzling behemoth. German intelligence had meticulously calculated its combat radius. With drop tanks, it could just about reach the German border, Aachen perhaps. Beyond that, the flying fortresses and liberators were on their own. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines, had better range but was considered vulnerable and unwieldy in the tight-turning dogfights the Germans favored. The calculus was simple and based on all available data correct. The heartland of the German Reich, its crucial industrial cities like Leipzig, Schweinfurt, and Berlin, was safe. The second misjudgment was industrial. German engineers, the finest in the world in their own estimation, could not conceive of the Americans solving the myriad problems of high-altitude, high-speed flights so quickly. The development cycles for their own aircraft, the Messerschmitt Bf-109, the Focke-Wulf Fw-190, had taken years. They were works of art, handcrafted by master technicians. American factories, they believed, produced crude, mass-produced tools. A report from a German agent in Detroit, later found to be wildly inaccurate, described the Willow Run plant as a circus of inefficiency, turning out airframes of questionable tolerances. The idea that this industrial behemoth could pivot to producing a fighter of transcendent quality seemed ludicrous. The third, and perhaps most fatal, misjudgment was one of imagination. The Germans were fighting a war of diminishing returns, of scarcity and improvisation. Their strategic thinking was constrained by reality. The Americans, they believed, were fighting a war of profligate waste. The sheer, staggering scale of what was being conceived and built in the vastness of the United States was simply beyond their mental horizon. They were looking at the war through the wrong end of the telescope. While German commanders worried about fuel allocations and pilot replacements, their American counterparts were thinking in terms of air armadas. The difference was not just one of degree, but of kind. This institutional arrogance was perfectly embodied in the person of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. After the catastrophic American losses during the second raid on Schweinfurt in October 1943, a day that became known as Black Thursday, where 60 B-17s were shot down and 138 damaged, Göring had reportedly laughed during a briefing. So, the Americans have learned their lesson. They see now that their unescorted bombers are nothing but flying coffins over the fatherland. He dismissed the notion of a true long-range escort fighter as a fantasy. The laws of physics, he insisted, were immutable. A fighter needed fuel. Fuel meant weight. Weight compromised performance. It was an iron triangle that not even the Americans could break. But there was one man, a lone, worried voice in the wilderness of German intelligence, who had seen a ghost. Oberstleutnant Joseph Beppo Schmid, head of the Luftwaffe's 5th Abteilung Intelligence, had been studying reconnaissance photos of English airfields taken in late November 1943. Something was different. Among the familiar shapes of the P-47s and P-38s, his photo interpreters had spotted a new, sleeker aircraft. It had a distinctive, laminar flow wing and a radiator intake slung under its fuselage. The initial reports were vague. They called it the XP-51 billion and estimated its performance as slightly superior to the FW-190. Schmid, a cautious man, filed a report suggesting further investigation. The report landed on the desk of General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, the legendary fighter ace. Galland, a practical combat man, scribbled a dismissive note in the margin. Another new type, probably another medium-range fighter like the others. The Americans change their designs like we change our socks. It is of no consequence. The report was buried. The ghost was ignored. What Galland, Göring, and Müller had dismissed as a fantasy was, in fact, the culmination of one of the most brilliant and audacious engineering gambles in military history. And its story began not in a gleaming American laboratory, but in the drawing offices of a British company, Supermarine, in 1940. The man who would unknowingly plant the seed for Germany's aerial defeat was not a general or an industrialist, but Sir Henry Royce, the co-founder of Rolls-Royce. His masterpiece, the Merlin engine, was the throbbing, supercharged heart of the Spitfire and Hurricane. But it was a different British mind that saw its true potential. Ronnie Harker, a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, climbed into the cockpit of a little-known American fighter called the North American Aviation Na-73X, or Mustang I, in April 1942. The airframe, designed in a breathtaking 117 days, was a revelation, sleek, agile, and fast. But its American Allison engine choked at high altitude. It was a thoroughbred hitched to a cart horse. Harker had a simple, brilliant idea. What if they married this beautiful American airframe to the magnificent British Merlin? He wrote a memo that would become legendary. The Mustang airframe and the Merlin 61 engine appear to be a marriage made in heaven. The Americans, initially skeptical, were persuaded to try. The result, the P-51 billion Mustang, was not an improvement. It was a transformation. It was alchemy. At 30,000 feet, where the B-17s fought their desperate battles, the Mustang came alive. Its speed jumped to over 440 mph. Its rate of climb became phenomenal. And most importantly, that beautiful, efficient airframe, when combined with the Merlin's power and new, jettisonable 110-gallon and then 150-gallon external fuel tanks, gave it something no other fighter in the European theater possessed. Legs. The development was so secret that even many senior American commanders were kept in the dark initially. The program was pushed forward with frantic, single-minded urgency by a small group of visionaries, chief among them Lieutenant General Jimmy Doolittle, the new commander of the 8th Air Force. Doolittle, the man who had led the audacious raid on Tokyo, understood air power in his bones. He saw the initial reports from the test pilots and knew, instantly, that this was the weapon that could win the air war. "This isn't a fighter," he reportedly told his staff. "It's a key, the key to the front door of Germany." But turning a prototype into a war-winning weapon required an industrial miracle, and that miracle's name was Ford. At the sprawling, mile-long Rouge River complex in Detroit, a manufacturing revolution was taking place that would have made the German agents' heads spin. Under the ruthless, brilliant direction of Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief, the factory was retooled with a speed and efficiency that defied belief. They didn't just build cars, they built an assembly line for victory. The process for manufacturing the Mustang's flawless laminar flow wings was so precise and so fast that German engineers, had they seen it, would have dismissed it as science fiction. By January 1944, the Rouge plant was spitting out a complete P-51 billion airframe every 90 minutes. North America's own plant in Inglewood, California, was matching this pace. The total was staggering. Over 500 Mustangs were rolling off the lines each month. The Americans weren't just building a new fighter, they were building a tidal wave of aluminum. The final, critical piece was the fuel. The standard internal fuel capacity of a P-51 billion was 184 gallons. That was good, but not enough. Then came the external tanks. The 110-gallon paper and resin tanks gave it the range to reach Berlin. But the new 150-gallon Misawa tanks made of molded plastic were the game changer. With two of these slung under its wings, a P-51 billion could carry nearly 500 gallons of fuel. Its combat radius exploded to over 650 miles. It could fly from England to Berlin, fight for 30 minutes, and return. It could fly from Italy to southern Germany. It could go anywhere. The training was equally frantic. Young American pilots, many with less than 300 hours total flight time, were pulled from other units and thrown into intensive conversion courses. They learned the Mustang's quirks, its breathtaking performance, and its one, terrifying vulnerability. That radiator scoop underneath made it susceptible to damage from below. They were told their mission was simple and utterly revolutionary. You will stick with the bombers, all the way. You are their shepherd. The wolf pack is yours to destroy. The first whispers of this coming storm began to reach German ears in December 1943 and January 1944, but they were dismissed as the desperate exaggerations of frightened pilots. A Focke-Wulf pilot returning from a harrowing engagement near Bremen reported being bounced by a new, incredibly fast single-engine fighter. It came out of the sun, took its shot, and was gone before I could even turn. His squadron commander patted him on the shoulder. A tempest, perhaps, or you saw a jet of your own exhaust. The Americans have nothing like that. On January 11, 1944, during a raid on Aschersleben, the Ghost appeared in greater numbers. A group of FW-190s was climbing to intercept the bomber stream when they were attacked from high above by a squadron of sleek, unfamiliar fighters. The German formation was broken up before it could even reach the B-17s. The after-action report from the German unit was filled with confusion. Enemy fighters exhibited performance characteristics far exceeding our own. Speed and climb rate are exceptional. They appear to have considerable range. The report made its way to Gallen's desk. This time, he didn't dismiss it outright. He circled the description of the aircraft and wrote a single word: Mustang. But the prevailing opinion at the OKL was that these were isolated incidents, perhaps involving a special high-altitude squadron. The idea that the Americans could field hundreds of such aircraft was still considered preposterous. The intelligence was filed away. The warning was, once again, ignored. The tension was palpable at the American airbase at Bodny, home of the 352nd Fighter Group, on the evening of February 19, 1944. The blue-nosed bastards of Bodny were one of the first groups fully equipped with the P-51 billion. In his quarters, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Mayer, a 24-year-old ace with 11 kills, studied the map for the next day's mission. The target was deeper than any they had attempted with full fighter escort, the fighter production plants at Leipzig and Bernburg. It was a 16-0-mile round trip, the very heart of the Reich. He traced the route with his finger, pausing over the predicted areas of German fighter concentration. He knew what was waiting for them. He also knew what he was leading. Outside, in the dimly lit hangars, crew chiefs swarmed over the Mustangs. The air reeked of high-octane fuel, cordite, and sweat. The sleek fighters were being armed, fueled, and checked with a reverence usually reserved for religious relics. The ground crews knew they were preparing something special. They were fitting the new 150-gallon tanks. They were polishing the canopies to a crystal clarity. They were checking the 12 yards of 50 caliber ammunition that fed the 4 heavy machine guns in each wing. One crew chief, Master Sergeant Mike Sobolski, wiped a smudge from the nose of his pilot's aircraft, Petty Second. He patted the cool aluminum skin. "You show 'em, baby," he whispered into the damp English night. "You show 'em all." The meteorology officer's forecast was grim, clear skies over the continent, perfect bombing weather, perfect fighter weather. At the briefing for the bomber crews, the reaction to the target was a collective, sharp intake of breath. Leipzig. It was a name that had come to symbolize death. The room was thick with cigarette smoke and fear. These were the men who had lived through Black Thursday. They knew the price of penetrating deep into Germany without a friendly wing in sight. When the briefing officer announced that the P-51s would be with them all the way to the target and back, a skeptical murmur ran through the room. They had heard promises before. Dawn on February 20, 1944, broke cold and clear. Across eastern England, the greatest aerial armada ever assembled began to stir. The sound started as a deep, resonant thrumming, a vibration felt in the bones rather than heard by the ears. Then, one by one, the engines of over 1,000 bombers and 900 fighters coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. The noise became a physical force, shaking the very ground, rattling windows in villages miles away. It was the sound of American industrial might taking wing. At Saint-Trond, Major Müller was awakened by the phone. The early warning chain had detected the formation. It was huge, bigger than anything they had seen before. He dressed quickly, his movements crisp and efficient. This was it. The big one. He drove to the operations shack through the lingering darkness, his headlights cutting through the fog. He felt a familiar thrill. Today would be a great day for the Luftwaffe. A Reichsverteidigung Day, a defense of the Reich Day. Today they would break the back of the American bomber offensive. High above the cold gray waters of the North Sea, the American formation droned eastward. It was a breathtaking, terrifying sight. Mile upon mile of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators flew in stacked combat boxes, their contrails painting thousands of parallel white lines across the blue sky. Surrounding them, weaving protectively, were the first wave of escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings. And then, flying higher still, almost at the very edge of visibility, were the new ones. The P-51 Mustangs of the 352nd, 354th, and 357th Fighter Groups. They flew with a different demeanor. The P-47s were like muscular bodyguards, sticking close to their charges. The Mustangs were like hawks, ranging far ahead, their pilots constantly scanning the empty sky with a predatory intensity. John Müller, leading the 352nd, keyed his radio. "Blue leader to blue flight. Keep it tight. Watch your fuel. Remember, we're in this for the long haul." He checked his gauges. The 150-gallon tanks were still feeding the hungry Merlin. They had been airborne for over an hour, and they hadn't even reached the Dutch coast yet. The real fight was still hours away. The first contact came over the Zuiderzee. A swarm of 4 Me-109s, probably from a coastal defense unit, dove on the trailing bomber box. They were met by a flight of P-47s. A brief, furious dogfight ensued at 20,000 feet. One Messerschmitt spiraled down, trailing black smoke. The others broke off. It was a skirmish, nothing more. The German pilots reported the contact, noting the presence of the usual escorts. The information filtered back to German air defense controllers. The script was proceeding as expected. As the vast armada crossed into German airspace near Osnabrück, the mood in the German control bunkers shifted from anticipation to confident preparation. This was the moment. The P-47s were at their absolute limit. They would have to turn back now. Major Müller, listening to the radio traffic in his shack at Saint-Trond, gave the order. "All units, this is JAG Division 3. The escorts are turning back. The bombers are naked. Engage, engage, engage." Across northwestern Germany, 23 Gruppen of fighters, over 300 FW-190s and Me-109s, began taking off from their dispersed airfields. They climbed towards the sun, forming up into massive attack formations. They were the hammer. The American bombers were the anvil. It was a plan that had worked many times before, but something was wrong. The P-47s, instead of turning back, pressed on for another 50 miles. Then another. The German fighter controllers, watching the plots on their radar screens, frowned. This was unusual. The Thunderbolts were burning their reserve fuel, a desperate measure. It would only delay the inevitable. Then the P-47s finally waggled their wings and turned for home. A sigh of relief went through the German bunkers. Now it begins. The first German Gruppe, led by the battle-hardened Hauptmann Erich Hartmann of JG-52, sighted the bomber stream near Brunswick. Hartmann, who would become the highest-scoring ace in history, had 150 kills to his name, most of them on the Eastern Front. He saw the tight formations of B-17s, their silver bodies gleaming in the high-altitude sun. He led his men into a climbing turn to position themselves for a classic head-on attack. This was the moment of supreme vulnerability for the Americans. He radioed his pilots, "Get ready, boys, target-rich environment." And then he saw them. High above the bombers, so high they were just specks, a new group of fighters was circling. They were not the bulky shapes of P-47s or the twin-tailed silhouettes of P-38s. They were lean, shark-like. And they were not leaving. Hartmann, a master of aerial tactics, felt the first cold trickle of doubt. He had never seen fighters this deep inside Germany. He assumed they were a decoy group, perhaps low on fuel, trying to bluff him. He decided to ignore them and press the attack. It was a decision born of experience, and it was about to become obsolete. As Hartmann's Gruppe nosed over into its attack dive, the specks above turned into arrows. They fell out of the sun with a rate of dive that seemed impossible. They weren't just fast, they were accelerating. In seconds they were among the German formation. The radio channels, previously calm and professional, erupted into chaos. "Was ist das? Was ist das? Achtung, Indianer Hawk. Sayer Hawk. I can't shake him. He's too fast." Hartmann, his attack broken up, found one of the new fighters on his own tail. He threw his Me-109 into a violent, gut-wrenching turn, a maneuver that had saved his life dozens of times. The American fighter turned with him. It stuck to him like a shadow. Hartman's eyes widened in disbelief. Nothing could outturn a 109 at medium altitude. Nothing. He chopped the throttle, popped the flaps, trying to force an overshoot. The American pilot anticipated the move, sliding to the side and then rolling back in. Tracers streaked past Hartman's canopy. For the first time in a very long time, Erich Hartmann was not the hunter. He was the prey. He broke off the fight, diving away desperately, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sky, which a minute before had been his private hunting ground, was now filled with these silver demons. The same scene was playing out all along the bomber stream. The carefully orchestrated German attacks were disintegrating into a series of confused, individual dogfights. The Mustangs, with their superior speed and maneuverability, were dictating the terms of the engagement. They hunted in pairs, using their devastating high-speed passes to break up the German formations before they could even threaten the bombers. A young American pilot, Lieutenant James Goody Goodson of the 336th Fighter Squadron, found himself in the middle of a swirling melee of 30 aircraft. He later wrote in his diary, "It was like a barroom brawl. Everyone was shooting at everyone, but we were the ones with the black belts." The reports flooding into the German fighter control centers were frantic, disjointed, and utterly unbelievable. Controllers stared at their maps, trying to make sense of the chaos. The bombers were still pressing on, unmolested. Their own fighters were being savaged by an escort force that, according to all their models and calculations, should not exist. In his shack at Saint-Trond, Major Müller listened to the panicked voices on the radio. His confident smile was gone, replaced by a deepening frown. He grabbed the telephone, demanding a clarification from division headquarters. The response was terse and bewildered. "The escorts are still with them. They are P-51s. They are everywhere." The American bomber force, sensing the shift, flew on with a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time, they were flying deep into Germany with guardian angels watching over them. The gunners in their turrets watched as the sleek Mustangs chased German fighters away from the formation, turning the Luftwaffe's own tactics against them. The fear began to be replaced by a fierce, grim pride. But the real shock was yet to come. The initial battles had taken place over central Germany. The target, Leipzig, was still 100 miles ahead. Standard doctrine dictated that even if an escort had penetrated this far, it would be at the absolute limit of its endurance. It would have to conserve fuel for the return trip. It would have to break off soon. The Mustangs did not break off. As the lead bombers began their bomb run over the Messerschmitt factory at Leipzig, the German controllers made one last, desperate gamble. They held back their final reserve, 2 fresh Gruppen of FW-190s, specially equipped with heavy 21 cm underwing rockets, designed to blast bombers out of the sky from outside the range of their defensive guns. These units were ordered to assemble east of the target, wait for the bombers to finish their run and begin the vulnerable turn for home, and then strike when their escorts would presumably be at their lowest ebb, low on fuel and ammunition. The plan was sound. It was logical. It was based on everything the Germans knew about aerial warfare. As the last bombs fell on Leipzig and the vast bomber stream began its ponderous 180-degree turn, the 2 rocket-equipped Gruppen pounced. They climbed out of the haze, aiming for the flanks of the formation. This was it, the killing blow, and then from above the bombers descended the Mustangs, not just the ones that had been fighting for the past hour. These were fresh. They were the groups that had been assigned to the rear of the formation, the rear support and target support flights. They had been conserving their fuel and their energy for this exact moment. They fell upon the rocket-laden FW-190s with a ferocity that was shocking. The German pilots, expecting to find tired, fuel-starved opponents, were instead met by a wall of 50 caliber fire. The rockets, which required a stable, straight flight path to aim, became death traps. The FW-190s, lumbering under their heavy loads, were sitting ducks. The sky filled with the flaming wreckage of German aircraft. The radio chatter from the German pilots turned from panic to sheer, unadulterated horror. They are still here. Impossible. They must have launched from France. My fuel. I have to break off. Where did they all come from? In his command bunker, General Galland, who had been monitoring the battle, slowly took off his headphones. The room was silent except for the crackle of the radios and the desperate, fading voices of his pilots. He walked to the large situation map. The red pins representing the American bombers were now well east of Leipzig, beginning their long journey home. And surrounding them, like a protective swarm of bees, were the markers for the escort fighters. They weren't just at the target, they were beyond it. They were over Poland. The unthinkable had happened. The Reichsluftraum, the sacred airspace of the German homeland, had been violated not just by bombers but by their fighter escorts. The defensive strategy of the entire Luftwaffe, a strategy built on the immutable laws of physics and range, had just been rendered obsolete in a single afternoon. But the day was not over. The bombers still had to fly all the way back. And the Germans, though bloodied and shocked, were not yet defeated. As the American formations droned westward, seeking the sanctuary of the setting sun and the English Channel, the Luftwaffe began to regroup. They had been dealt a terrible blow, but they were not out of punches. Every German fighter within 200 miles was being vectored to intercept the returning stream. They would hit them on the way out. They had to. The alternative was unthinkable. High above the retreating armada, John Mayer checked his fuel gauges again. The 150-gallon tanks were long gone, jettisoned empty over the target. He was running on internal fuel now. The fight back was going to be tight, very tight. He looked at his wingman, gave a thumbs up, and then scanned the sky to the west. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows across the German countryside below. It was then that he saw them. Not the scattered, disorganized attacks of before. This was something different. This was a coordinated last-ditch effort. Coming from the south, a solid wall of enemy aircraft, more than he had ever seen in one place, was climbing to intercept them. It wasn't a group. It was an entire Jeschwader, maybe two. Every available fighter the Germans had left was being thrown into this one, final, desperate attack. A ultima carta de Luftwaffe. Mayer sent you no de gelo si former no estimego. Ales estivem no limite, seus homens estivem cansados, com baxa munição e combustível. E agora isso. Ele engoliu seco. A boca repentinamente arida, e transmitiu pelo radio. Sua voz deliberadamente calma. Contrast gritante com o rugido do motor e o caos que se avizinhava. Blue leader para todos os elementos. Mantenham a formação. Eles vão para o último baile. Now deixam ninguém sozinho. O seu est torno-se baro em movimento, uma nuvem de insetos metálicos que rapidamente se transformarão nas formas distintas e ameaçadoras de Focke-Wulfs e Messerschmitts. Eles não vinem com a precisão tática dos combates interiores. Vinem com a fúria desesperada de animal acuado. Era ataque frontal massivo, jeffersverben de última hora, projetado para romper a formação de bombardeiros a qualquer custo, ignorando as escoltas. A carnificina seria imensa. Os primeiros foguetes WGR. 21 disparados dos caças alemes cortarem o céu. Suas trilhas de fumaça branca serpentindo direção as caixas de bombardeiros, como cobras venenosas. As explosos entre as formações foram enxerdadas. Abrindo buracos momentâneos no tecido ordenado dos B-17s. Fortaleza, atingido diretamente, desintegrou-se uma bolas de fogo laranja e aço retorcido, sem deixar perquedas. E então os Mustangs mergulharam. Não havia mais tempo para táticas sofisticadas, para mergulhos de alta altitude. Era corpo a 25 pace. Mayor miru no lighter de formasso alema. FW 190 com uma distinta fixa amarela na fuselagem. Ele mergulho. Os canhos de 20 do alema cuspindo fogo e aço, sua direção. As balas de traçante passarem por sua cabine como fogos de artificio de morte. Ele espero, seguro, e então, quando o FW 190 encheu seu reticulo, apertou o botão. Suas quatro metralhadoras de calibre 50 rugiram. Som profundo e satisfatório que fez seu avel tremer levemente. Os projéteis perfurantes e incendiários atingiram a assadeira do Focke-Wulf, arrancando pedaços e iniciando incêndio que rapidamente engoliu a fuselagem. O avião alemão captou e mergulhou chamas direção à terra. O caos era absoluto. O radio era uma cacofonia de avisos, gritos e estática. Quebra escada. Na sua cauda blue for. Estucamam na cola alguém me ajuda. O seu torno-se uma tapeçaria giratória de avios entrelaçados, rastros de fumaça e as manchas solitárias de paraquedas brancos se abrindo alguns americanos, moídos a lemes. A eficiência assassina dos Mustangs foi posta à prova mais severa. Eles eram mais rápidos, mais ágeis, mas os pilotos alemes eram experientes, desesperados e lutavam sobre sua própria terra. Eles conheciam cada truque, cada manobra evasiva desesperada. Goody Goodson, seu Mustang, bateu for, marcado com suásticas de suas vitórias, encontrou-se travado duelo mortal com Mi 109G. O piloto alemão era veterano, forçando Goodson a uma série de tesouras e mergulhos bruscos. Goodson sentiu uma bala de 13 perfurar sua asa, mas o Mustang continuou respondendo. Ele finalmente conseguiu uma solução de tiro quando o alemão, era momentâneo, nivelou seu voo por uma fração de segundo. A sarevada de Goodson atingiu a fuselagem atrás de cabine. Mi 109 entrou lento e terminal giro para a direita, mergulhando direção às nuvens abaixo. Enquanto isso, nas operações de Saint-Trond, a atmosfera havia mudado de confiança para confusão e agora para desespero silencioso. Major Müller estava calado ao radio, seu rosto pálido e severo. As vozes que vinham dos fones não eram mais dos seus pilotos triunfantes. Eram transmissões truncadas, gritos abafados, pedidos de ajuda e, por fim, o silêncio estático que significava uma aeronave perdida. Ele olhou para o mapa, onde seu assistente, o jovem Tenente Fisher, movia as pequenas suásticas com mãos trêmulas, reiterando-as uma a uma. A grande armadilha que ele havia planejado havia se transformado em motor de carne, e eram os seus homens que estavam sendo moídos. Eles ainda estão como eles, Herr Major, sussurrou Fisher, sua voz quebrada. Os P-51, mesmo agora, e acute como se não tivessem fim. Müller não respondeu. Ele pegou o relatório interceptado que havia sido sua bíblia horas antes. O papel, outrora trofeu, agora parecia uma farsa cruel. Ele o amassou sua mão, os nossos dos dedos brancos de raiva e uma vergonha que começava a broder seu peito. Ele havia sido tolo. Ele havia subestimado o inimigo de uma forma tal fundamental que beirava a negligência. Aquele documento não era ouro. Era isca e ele havia mordido como ganância de país jovem. No ar, a batalha começou a mudar. O impeto do ataque alemão, tal feroz no início, começou a se dissipar. Os Mustangs, apesar de estar no limite, estavam infligindo perdas insustentáveis. Por os caças alemes, ficando sem combustível e munição, ou danificados, foram forçados a abandonar a luta. A formação de bombardeiros, embora sangrando, mantém sua coesão. A muralha de fogo das metralhadoras 52 B-17s, Agora auxiliata pilos adex incessans des escoltas, tornusi uma barra quaes intransponivel. John Mayer, comas avisos de combustible critico piscando su panel, fez ultimo balanço. O seu ao redor estava ficando mais vazio. A grande formação alemã havia se desintegrado. Ele viu último, FW 190 tentando se posicionar, para ataque final a B-17 solitário, qualquer para trás de formação. De seus motors fumigando. Com suspiro de exausto Mayer mergulhou. Ele não preciso adorar. A mira presença de seu Mustang, surgindo do nada, foi o suficiente. O piloto alemão, vendo-o, aborto seu ataque e mergulhou em fuga, desaparecendo nas nuvens abaixo. Era auto de pura dissuasão. O poder do P-51 não estava apenas em sua capacidade de matar, mas em sua onipresença psicológica. A transmissão de radio de Mayer foi ouvida por todos os Mustangs e por muitos dos bombardeiros. Sua voz estava espera pela fadiga, mas carregada de uma autoridade inabalável. Blue Leader para todos os elementos. A festa acabou. Vamos para casa. A longa e agonizante jornada de volta começou. Para os pilotos dos Mustangs, tornou-se uma batalha de uma só frente. Contra o medidor de combustível. Por eles começaram a transmitir a mensagem temida. Mayday, Mayday, Blue 3 motor morrendo, abandonando a aeronave. Blue 7, combustível no vermelho. Vou tentar chegar a costa. Mayer desligou seu radio, economizando cada fração de energia de bateria. Ele ajustou a mistura de combustível para o mais pobre possível, reduziu a rotação do motor para o mínimo de cruzeiro e começou uma subida lenta e constante, ganhando cada pé de altitude que podia para longo plano de volta, se necessário. A paisagem abaixo, outrora a fortaleza Europa impenetrável, agora era apenas obstáculo entre ele e a sobrevivência. Ele passou por cima de cidades e rios, suas assas brilhando sob o sol de tarde, fantasma prateado em seu que agora, milagrosamente, estava quase vazio. Abaixo, no solo alemão, civis e soldados assistiam a procissão. Era espetáculo de poderio e raio absoluto. Eles estavam acostumados a ver bombardeiros, mas nunca tantos, e certamente nunca com uma escolta de caças tão numerosa retornando como eles. Para muitos, foi o momento em que a realidade de guerra mudou irrevogavelmente. O mito de inviolabilidade do espaço aéreo alemão estava destruído, dissipado pelo zumbido continuo de milhares de motores americanos. Dos pilotos daquele retorno foi o Tenente Robert Bob Johnson, de 56th Fighter Group, voando P-47. Mesmo os robustos Thunderbolts estavam no limite. Johnson, mais tarde acute famoso, viu Mustang solitário, o de John Mayer, passando por ele, sua velocidade ainda notável mesmo na reserva de combustível. Ele percebeu a diferença fundamental. O P-47 era punho de aço, o P-51 era uma lâmina de rapier. Ambos matavam, mas mudava a própria natureza do campo de batalha. De volta a Saint-Trond, o silêncio era opressivo, o telefone tocou, era o comando de divisão. Müller atendeu, sua voz monotona. As notícias eram piores do que ele imaginava. As perdas preliminares da Luftwaffe eram catastróficas. Mais de 60 caças abatidos, com dezenas de outros danificados. Muitos de seus pilotos mais experientes estavam mortos ou capturados. E o pior de tudo, a fábrica de caças de Leipzig havia sido gravemente danificada. O golpe duplo era quase incompreensível. Müller desligou o telefone e olhou para Fischer. O jovem tenente perseguidor envelhecido 10 anos em uma única tarde. O relatório, Herr Major, perguntou Fischer, sua voz fio. Müller olhou para a bolas de papel em sua mesa. Canto de fadas, Fischer, e nas acre didamos nil. Elecamen hu ate a janela e al hu pero seu, agravazio e pacifico, a chuva havia parado, o que aconteceu hod, now foi uma batalha, foi uma revolução, e nós, velhos soldados, fomos pigos de surpresa. Enquanto isso, sobre o canal de Mancha, a tensão nos cockpits dos Mustangs era palpável. A costa inglesa era uma linha escura e bem-vinda no horizonte. Por eles começaram a pausar, seus tanques de combustível quase secos. Alguns motors moram na final, forçando os pilotos a fazerem aterrissagens de pane seca. Outros pausaram com tal pouco combustível que os mecânicos, ao abrirem as portas do abastecimento, não conseguiam detectar o cheiro de gasolina. John Mayer pausou, petty second. Embadni como motor engasgando e morrendo no momento, em que ele ralo para seu hardstand. Ele ficou sentado no cockpit por longo momento, suas mãos ainda tremendo levemente de adrenalina, o silêncio repentino após o rugido constante do Merlin parecendo uma coisa física. Ele tirou o capacete e esfregou o rosto. Quando ele desceu, suas pernas quase cederam. O mestre Sargento Cebulski estava lá, seu rosto uma mistura de preocupação e orgulho. Quase não volto hein, coronel, disse Cebulski, colocando a mão na fuselagem quente. Mayer alhu para o avião, para as marcas de bala na asa, para o tanque vazio. Ela nos traux para casa, Mike. Ela nos traux para casa. Ele alhu volta. A base estava cheia do som de outros Mustangs pausando, hino cansado mas vitorioso. Ele viu Goodson desembarcar e dar duplo jolho no caio, exausto, mas vivo. Eles haviam feito isso. Naquela noite, o relatório de inteligência da oitava força aérea começou a pintar quadro claro. As perdas de bombardeiros, embora dolorosas, foram uma fração do que se temia menos de 6%. Número drasticamente menor do que os 20-30% de Quinta-feira Negra. E o custo para a Luftwaffe havia sido devastador. A Luftwaffe não apenas perdeu dezenas de pilotos insubstituíveis, mas sua doutrina de defesa aérea havia sido publicamente e brutalmente desmascarada. Em Berlim, a risal foi de choque e negação. Goering se recusou inicialmente a acreditar nos números. Quando confrontado com a evidência irrefutável por Galland, ele explodiu em acesso de raiva, culpando os pilotos por sua falta de coragem e os engenheiros por sua falta de visão. Ele não conseguia, ou não queria, compreender que o problema não era o espírito de seus homens, mas a física superior da máquina que agora enfrentavam. Galland, muito mais sobrio, enviou memorando confidencial ao alto comando. Era documento lucido e profético. Neil, ele escreveu as palavras que se tornariam famosas. Quando Roman 6 os Mustangs sobre Berlim, sabe que a guerra aérea estava perdida. Ele argumentou que, a partir daquele dia, a iniciativa não pertencia irrevogavelmente aos aliados. A Luftwaffe poderia continuar a lutar, poderia até infligir baixas locais, mas a defesa do Reich, como concebida, era impossível. A batalha de 20 de fevereiro de 1944, que ficaria conhecida como a Batalha de Big Week, não foi o fim da Luftwaffe, mas foi o princípio do fim. Nos dias que se seguiram, os Mustangs repetiram sua performance, dia após dia, atingindo alvos por toda a Alemanha. A fachada de invencibilidade alemã não rachu e depois desmoronou. A indústria de caças alemã, o próprio alvo de Big Week, foi tão danificada que produção, que deveria estar subindo, estagnou e depois caiu. Para os homens no caiu, como o Major Müller, a mudança foi imediata e pessoal. Dentro de uma semana, sua unidade em Saint-Trond foi dizimada, suas experiências tripulações substituídas por meninos verdes com treinamento apressado. O sorriso confiante nunca mais voltou ao seu rosto. Elesi tornu, homum amargurado, comandando fantasma de uma unidade que outrora for temevel. A estrada do mapa su rasto agra levava bico sem seda. E para as homens no ar, como John Mayer, foi o inicio de uma nova era. O sucesso de 20 de fevereiro validou a estratégia de Doolittle de atrás deles and cur que estagem. Os Mustangs now eram mais apenas escoltas. Eles eram caçadores. Eles variam as seias à frente dos bombardeiros, atacando aerodromos, trens, qualquer coisa que se movesse, travando a Luftwaffe no caio e no ar. A superioridade aérea, a quel conceito elusivo, havia sido conquistada. A revolução que chegou nas assaz do P-51 Mustang naquele dia chuvoso de fevereiro foi mais do que tecnológica, foi doutrinária, estratégica e psicológica. Ela provou que a coragem, quando apoiada pela ingenuidade industrial implacável e pela visão científica, poderia de fato superar a experiência endurecida pela batalha e a arrogância institucional. O zumbido do Merlin motor não era apenas o som de avião. Era o som de futuro inevitável chegando, futuro que, para o terceiro Reich, era agora presente sombrio e inescapável. A armadilha havia se fechado, não torno de grupo de bombardeiros, mas torno de toda uma força aérea e de estratégia de defesa que ela representava. E as seias, acima da Europa nunca mais seriam as mesmos.